Why do people file bankruptcy? Did they just spend too much money, or is there more to it than that? It's an important question. Ted is here to discuss it, starting right now.
This is Debt Free in 30. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
If I was to survey the general population and ask them, why do people go bankrupt? The answer I would probably get would be something like, wow, they spent too much money, they were irresponsible, or whatever. This is a very important question to answer because if you don't diagnose the problem correctly, then whatever solutions you're going to come up with will undoubtedly be wrong. So what's the real story? Ted is here to discuss it. So Ted, welcome back. Do you agree with my opening comment there as to how people would respond to that survey question?
It seems like a pretty oversimplification of the problem. I mean, it's not that people were irresponsible. Think back 3 years ago, and maybe there'd be a bias for that, but given that we've all lived through a pandemic now for over a year, I'm pretty sure that folks will realize that, well, stuff happens.
And I appreciate you saying stuff happens because that way I didn't have to
edit it.
I didn't have to edit it or put the not safe for work warning on the podcast. So let's discuss this whole concept then of, financial mismanagement or frivolous, spending or whatever. I don't believe that is the primary cause of insolvency, and we're going to talk about that.
Right.
But even more than that, the reason this is important is if you misdiagnose the problem, then you're going to come up with the wrong solution. So we all can think back to 250 years ago when the doctors thought the problem was bad blood. Mm-hmm. So, of course, the solution is, bloodletting. Now, that's kind of a gross analogy. Can you give me an analogy that's maybe a little less gross than that?
Well, we'll stick with the medical. My oldest daughter caught a football last week, and it bent her finger back. And she said, I'm fine. It just turned blue, and it was, bruised. Well, no, we had it x-rayed, and she broke her finger. And if we hadn't known that, it wouldn't have been splinted. We wouldn't have immobilized it. It wouldn't heal properly. And instead of just going with what we thought was the issue and saying, we can fix that, just ignore it, we figured out what the real problem was. And usually you have to turn to a professional to find that out.
Yeah, and so the solution was you put a splint or a cast on it. You don't just hope it gets better.
Right. You have to immobilize it. Whatever it is, make it so that it's not moving for a period of time so it can start to heal.
And so in the financial world then, we have this, the general public, and you and I, we talk to the media all the time, and that's kind of what their perception is as well.
Well,
right?
The classic example is that people go broke because they're spending money in crazy ways. They're not being responsible. They just do things. And the concern we always have with the solution is, well, sure, we can fix your debt problem, but if we haven't solved the underlying issue, it's just going to repeat itself, which I guess would be good for business, but it would it's not good for the people we're dealing with.
We're not helping people. And
right.
So if the cause of financial problems is, I'm just not good with money, then the solution is we should have mandatory budgeting classes for all.
Which we do.
And is that an effective solution to our problems?
Well, I mean, the most common issue is that there's more money going out than coming in. So it's not that people are frivolous. They're spending this money on their basic living expenses, to pay the rent, to put groceries, to pay other debts. So if they don't have enough cash coming in, they've got to access it from someplace. The first thing they do is they access credit. So they put it on their credit cards, or worse, they go to those installment loans that payday people, all of that stuff I really hate.
Yeah, and I'll try to keep you away from that topic today. So, and you and I, every year, Ted Michalos releases our Joe Debtor bankruptcy study, yep. And the last few years, the numbers have been pretty clear. It cost me this much to service my debt, right. But I don't have anywhere near enough coming in to pay all my living expenses and pay all of my debt.
Yeah, if I think back to this year's example, I think the average person we talk to has about $250 to deal with their debts, and it's somewhere around $1,500 that they're required for their minimum payments. And so it just can't be done.
Yeah, and our average client is going to have unsecured debt of, $50,000, $60,000. Well, right. You can do the math pretty easily. $250 isn't going to cover it.
Yep.
So why do people get into financial trouble? Well, you just hit the first issue, which is living costs. It just costs too much to live. And I mean, we're recording this in 2021 now, if I have my years correct. Back in, 2018, 2019, before the pandemic, rent costs were really high in places like Toronto. as we record this, they've come down a bit because people aren't living in the city, but incomes have also been under pressure. So it's not hard to figure out why people don't have enough money coming in. So, I just don't have enough money coming in to make a go of it is an obvious example. Yep. What are other reasons that people get into financial trouble?
So another really common one, particularly with the younger folks, is student debt. So, I mean, when you and I went to school, back when they were using abacus and chalkboards, you didn't come out of school owing a lot of money. Now it's pretty common for the kids to owe $20,000, $30,000, $40,000. It's not unusual. And it really puts a cramp on their whole life development, because you've got to defer all of these things like starting a family or buying a house or even getting a newer vehicle, saving for your retirement until you put this debt away. And in a lot of cases, they can't deal with the debt. It's too large.
Yeah. And again, this is why I wanted to do this show, because, old people like you and me, and I went to university
Could you say that louder?
In the 1980s, which was a long time ago, and tuition for me was $1,000 a year.
Yep.
And so it was actually possible to get a summer job making minimum wage and cover tuition quite easily, actually. Right. Whereas now that's impossible. Yeah. You just cannot do it. So if you're sitting there thinking, well, the reason all these kids today, and of course kids today are 35 years old, but the reason all these people have this student debt is because they didn't work hard enough and they weren't prudent. No, the math is stacked against them.
It just doesn't work.
And so again, thinking that budgeting is the solution is kind of missing the point. So okay, living expenses are really high. People who have financed their education with student loans end up with a huge amount of student debt, which is a big payment they have to make, which of course makes the living costs even higher. What are other issues that get people into trouble?
Focus on people our age. They end up either co-signing debts for their children or for their parents, or they're paying helping the living or debt costs for their children or their parents. So suddenly you've got one family now trying to deal with the expenses for two or maybe three because the family's become extended.
Well, and again, as we record this, the real estate market is humming.
Jeez,
and of course, it's been humming for the last 10 or 15 years, so I guess it wouldn't have mattered when we'd recorded this. I always specify that because if you're watching this in the year 2025, maybe the real estate market has finally crashed by then, but it hasn't here in 2021. How can you possibly, as a 30-year-old, buy a house without having some family help? Like it's almost impossible unless you and your spouse both have fantastic jobs and have managed to save up a whole bunch of money. So your parents will often say, okay, I'm going to kick in some money.
Yep.
Now, if your parents have a bunch of cash sitting there, no big deal. But the more likely scenario is your parents also own a house, which has gone up huge in value. So they got lots of equity, but they need to tap into it with cash.
Right.
So what do? Take out a mortgage on their house to give you the down payment on yours. So that's not exactly co-signing, but that's, contributing money.
Well, but I mean, the other thing that parents or other family members do is they do co-sign for debts. So, okay, you can get enough, they can scrounge the money for the down payment on a house, but still their budget doesn't show that you can afford the mortgage. So, all right, so we'll sign off on that too. Or, I mean, even more typical than that, you get out of school, you're just starting out in life. There are things that you have to do. All right, well, you never stop being a parent. So maybe your kid needs to help set up that first apartment, or maybe you need to buy them that car so they can get back and forth to that first job. Or maybe they've come out with all kinds of student debt and you're trying to help them with that. There are lots of reasons why people need help.
Yeah, and I mean, you raise the issue of a car. Okay, well, a car costs, there are no $2,000 brand new cars out there, I don't think.
Only if you're in China.
There you go. And so you're going to pay $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 for a car. Again, I'm a new student, recent graduate. Well, my credit is not such that I can afford to do that. So somebody co-signs on the dotted line for me. Or maybe I've got a bunch of debt accumulated. My parents or another family member says, okay, I will co-sign to get you a consolidation loan to cover it. If you can't pay, well, guess what? They're now stuck with the debt.
Think about the gig economy, right? So you got out of school, you got a job, and so you started all this stuff, you incurred some debt. And 6 months later, the job disappears. Well, that's just the way that economy works. Yeah, somebody's got to help you out.
Right, and part of the gig economy is, well, I'm going to start my own, side hustle.
Right.
Or maybe actual business. I'm a roofer. I can start a roofing business. I'm an electrician, whatever. Well, it costs money to do that. Right. I don't have any money, so again, I'm relying on others to do it. So that again ends up being a cause of financial problem for the person who's doing the co-signing. So, okay, keeping up with living costs, student loans, co-signing, what else gets people into trouble?
Well, somehow your family ends up living on one income instead of two. So lots of households establish their spending and their living patterns because both partners are working. They may not be working full-time each, but there's two sources of income coming in. And so you've built your life based on that amount of money, and then something happens. It could be something as simple as, well, somebody got sick, and so they weren't able to work as much anymore. Or maybe their job got sent to Tennessee. Or maybe the marriage has fallen apart, and now you're both going your separate ways, and you've got to deal with this debt somehow.
Or maybe there was this pandemic, and for a year and a half, nobody could leave their house. I mean, and as a result, the job I had as a chef or as a, personal trainer or, working in a restaurant or whatever at a hair salon, that job isn't there anymore.
They're all on hold.
And it's not unusual for both spouses to be in the same industry.
That's true.
We both worked at the same restaurant. That's how we met, in fact. So we're both in that business.
Yep.
So as a result, it can go from one income to zero income. But yes, it's, again, we started off talking about living costs. Well, how do you cover living costs? Well, you have two incomes.
Right.
And so when you lose one of the incomes, that obviously makes a huge difference.
And one of the things nobody seems to realize is that your income can change overnight. You can lose your job tomorrow. You can't change your expenses overnight. If you're in a lease for an apartment, you've got a car payment, you got to keep eating. I mean, there are things you got to pay for every month. And if the money's not there, it's got to come from someplace.
Yeah, I can make minor tweaks. Okay, I guess I won't buy a new pair of jeans this month.
Right.
But you're right. I can't just, instantly stop paying on my 6-year car loan.
Even more basic than that, you can't stop paying the phone bill. Right? You can't stop paying the insurance on your car. All of these things have got to be paid for.
Yeah, and you're right. Food is kind of an important one.
I've gotten used to eating.
I'm a big fan of that myself. So all of these things leads to what? Well, it leads to I got to use debt to survive.
Right. So when you run out of cash, you turn to credit. And then when things get really horrible is when you run out of reasonably priced credit, then you switch to the really expensive stuff. And it's not so much that an individual credit card gets you into trouble. It's 2 or 3 credit cards, and then loading up the line of credit to pay them off, and then they run them up again, and then the higher interest forms of debt. So, well, you knew I was going to talk about you got
I tried to keep you away from payday loans today.
And you got the installment loans, those, the loans at 49 to 59% interest. All of that stuff, once you get into those things, you can't get out from under them, and you can't sustain the payments. It just can't be done.
And you hit the idea of the whole job loss thing. So that's really the whole job loss cycle then, right?
Right.
That's what you're describing?
It's a pattern. So whenever you get into financial difficulty, it's a very unique experience. You're the one living it. But we've seen people there, like, what's the old joke with the man in the hole? The fella's in the bottom of a hole. He can't get out. Another guy runs along and jumps in. He said, well, what the hell did you do that for? Now we're both in the hole. Yeah, but I've been down here before. I know the way out. Right? We know the way out.
And so tell me some stories then. Give me some examples of how job loss or an interruption in income can lead to debt. Is it as simple as, well, I guess I start using credit cards and then I go down the path, or is it more nuanced than that?
That's the most basic example, and we can use COVID for that. So the government very generously gave everybody $2,000 a month if they were out of work, and they weren't too particular about why your income stopped. But if you were used to making $3,000 a month, suddenly there's only $2,000, and you're supposed to be saving some for income taxes off of that. Where's that other $1,000 coming from? It's just a fact that most people don't have savings anymore. The basic safety plan for the average individual seems to be, well, I've got this $10,000 line of credit. If anything goes wrong, I'll use it. Well, COVID comes along and they use it. Well, the $10,000 gets used up pretty quickly. The example I just gave you, within 10 months, you'll have had to have used it for that $1,000 every month. And then what do you do? Well, so we load up our credit cards, we take cash advances, and now, wait a minute, I've got an extra payment. I don't just need $3,000 anymore. I need to be able to make the payment on the line of credit and the credit cards. Well, so I take more money, and then I start switching to I don't have access to the reasonable credit anymore, so now I've got to start using these things that I shouldn't be using.
Yeah, because you have no choice. And I think that's really the point we're trying to make here. It's not that because if you're not in this situation, you look at someone who's got a bunch of credit card debt, you go, well, obviously you spent too much.
Right.
Well, yes, mathematically I spent more than I had, but here's the progression: job loss, or I started out behind the eight ball.
Right.
You know, I'm starting out with a bunch of student loan debt, so I got a big payment every month right off the bat. I've helped someone co-sign. I've, gone down to one income. And as a result, I get into this trap where it's like, well, what am I going to do? So if we think back to March of 2020, when the lockdown started,
right.
2 weeks to flatten the curve, right? We all thought, okay, well, this is not going to be a long-term thing.
Right. By the summer, things will be back to normal.
And we all knew it wasn't going to be 2 weeks. We knew that wasn't the thing, but we all figured, okay, well, a couple of months, 3 months, 4 months. So it makes sense to draw on my line of credit, use the credit cards just to bridge the gap. And we see this all the time. I get laid off, but I figure, well, I'll be back to work pretty soon.
Right. I'm going to find a job.
I'm going to find a job.
Yep.
I've never had problems finding a job before. Well, you and I talk to a lot of people now here in 2021 who say, you know what? I've never had this much trouble finding a job anymore.
Right.
Well, because the whole world has changed. And that's what gets people into the cycle. So that was kind of the main point that we wanted to make today, that bankruptcy is not caused by I spent too much and I was, bad with my money.
Right.
There are a whole lot of external factors that come into it. So
stuff happens.
Exactly. Well, and you talked about the one income example. Divorce leads to a huge amount of money problems as well.
Well, and it's arguably it's worse than the had a job interruption or something happened with my income but we're still a family, because now you're two separate families. And in a lot of cases, to make yourself feel better, you don't pay as much attention to the details when you're going through a marital breakdown or separation. So maybe you order out more often because you come home and you just don't have the energy. You got to set up two houses instead of just one. You're trying to win the favor of the kids, so you're more likely to, here's whatever they need for school or whatever it is they want. And money isn't your first concern while the rest of your life is running into trouble.
Yeah, it's exactly like with anything else. If I'm going through a medical problem, then that's my primary concern, not the money. And you hit the key point there that, the old saying, two can live as cheaply as one.
Right.
It's probably not true, but it's not entirely inaccurate, because obviously we only need one place to live, not two.
Yep.
We're paying one phone bill, one cable bill, one hydro bill. Maybe we only need one car, but when we're in two households, well, we obviously need double everything.
Right.
And how do you, going through that, manage to set up a new household? Well, you got to use debt to do it.
How do you transition from two back to one?
Now, so marriage breakup is a huge one. Illness, you mentioned that earlier. That would be a huge one as well. What examples, is it as simple as, well, I'm sick and I'm off work? Because again, people think, well, we're in Canada. We've got free health care. That's, how can that cause a problem?
But healthcare is only the tip of the iceberg. So, recently my wife had knee surgery, and I've been booking off days to take her to physiotherapy and all sorts of stuff. And it's great that we're in a situation where I can do that. Not everybody can. And so there's the caregiver aspect to every illness. Are you as focused on your job while you're looking after a family member? Do you have to miss work because you're looking after a family member? And we don't really have a system in place to support that. If you end up going off on a leave yourself and on EI, well, again, now we're back to the example where EI is paying you $2,000 a month, but the family's used to you having $3,000 coming in, and you're in trouble.
Yeah, you're right. It's not the cost of the surgery itself, because that's covered by our healthcare program.
As long as you can wait long enough.
Right, yeah. You're not going to get in there tomorrow probably. But you're right. You got to now go for physio afterwards.
Yep.
Well, I can't drive my car because I just had my leg operated on. Someone else has got to drive me. And you can't, if you work at let's say you're a truck driver, a long distance truck driver, you can't take an hour off work to go to physio.
Particularly if you're in Alberta.
Right. So it's like, okay, I'm going to have to take a few weeks off. Or maybe I work in a factory. Well, again, I can't take an hour off. I've got to take the day off. And so that compounds it quite a bit. We've had lots of clients in the past too who have ended up literally going off work or retiring to care for another family member, whether it's a disabled child or a spouse that's going through medical issues. So those things, again, compound it quite a bit.
And none of those things are things that you can plan for, particularly if it was an injury at work or something completely unexpected. Nobody ever knows that they're going to come home and find out that they have a cancer diagnosis. You can't plan for that. and you've got to adapt your life.
Well, and what do you do if you get rear-ended and you get whiplash? Okay,
Right.
well, that wasn't my fault. It was a red light. That's why I stopped.
Yep.
But somebody wasn't paying attention, and now I've got medical issues, I got car issues and whatever. So
Right.
there's a lot of stuff that happens, which is what gets people into these problems. Now, I think when you and I talk on this podcast in the summer or the fall of 2021, looking back over the last year or two, one of the big issues we will see causing problems for people is business failures.
And the storm is coming.
And it hasn't fully hit yet because there have been a significant amount of government supports in place.
Yep.
So there's been the wage subsidy, there's been the rent subsidy, and there have been a lot of loan programs.
Well, and there's been a lot of deferral programs from the credit community. But between all of those things, it's basically mean it hasn't come to a head yet.
And I have talked to a number of people over the last few months who operate a retail establishment, whether it's a store or a hair salon or whatever,
Yep.
and they're closed or operating at drastically reduced capacity. And so the landlord is sort of like, okay, well, I'm not going to do anything yet because there's really no sense in foreclosing on or terminating your lease because I got no one else to put in here anyways.
Right.
But at some point, particularly with the big landlords, I think this will be where it's more pronounced. It's like, well, we got to get our money.
Well, and people forget that the landlords have mortgages and obligations too. So just because you can't pay means that they're not getting paid, which means they can't pay.
Yeah, they've got to pay the property taxes because it's not like the city's giving them a break. They got
Right.
to pay the mortgage, the operating costs, utilities, whatever. So what we have done is kick the can down the road.
Right.
So,
And before all of this started, insolvencies were way up. I mean, we were looking at 25, 30% growth month over month before all of this started back in the spring of 2020. And this has put all of that on hold. Plus, it's added a whole nother level to the activity that we're going to see.
right. The debt is still there.
In fact, it's higher than it was before.
Right. But the insolvencies aren't happening because, well, I'm not working. I don't need to go bankrupt because
Right.
no one's going to garnish my wages. So we're going to see, significant issues at some point. I don't know if it's the fall of 2021. I don't know if it's 2022, 2023. A lot of it depends on what the government continues to do, what
Right.
landlords do, and so on. So, okay, let us wrap this up then with practical advice. And you've already alluded to a couple of things, but what is your practical advice for someone who is dealing with all of these kinds of debt issues?
Everybody's heard the expression, you can't see the forest for the trees. It may very well be that you are too intimately involved in this that you can see a solution. If you had a sore tooth, you'd call a dentist. If you're injured yourself, you go to the hospital, you have the bone set. Well, finances are the same way. It sounds like a commercial, but frankly, if you think you're in financial difficulty, you probably are, and you should speak to a professional.
And you gave the example of your daughter with her broken finger that, it wasn't obvious that it was broken.
Right.
Well, what was the downside to actually having an x-ray done?
Nothing.
Not much.
Right.
And that way okay, this is a more serious problem than you've got. When people contact us, we do the same diagnosis. Okay, tell me about the issue. And some people will call in and they'll say, well, I just got laid off. I know I'm back to work in a month. And I know that, over the next few months, we're going to be pretty busy and there's going to be lots of overtime. Okay, well, then my advice would probably be, hang in there.
Yep.
Just wait. I mean, maybe you got to call some of your creditors and get some deferrals, reduce your payments or whatever, but there's light at the end of the tunnel.
Right.
So, I'm expecting a tax refund, whatever, you can hang in there. But if the answer is, well, no, in your example, my company has closed down and gone to Tennessee. I don't know if everyone's going to Tennessee.
Not anymore.
But not anymore.
Well, they're not going to China anymore.
Yeah, there's no place to go. But my company is closed down. They aren't reopening.
Right.
Okay, so the industry I'm in, there may not be a direct path to a new job. And we've done shows on reinventing yourself to figure out new ways of doing things. The point is, you got to look at where you're at, explore the different options, and then come up with the solutions from there.
I mean, the whole thrust of this entire program has been, it's not just the debt. You have to figure out what the underlying problem is and address it too. And in most cases, people aren't equipped to necessarily see that themselves. You need to get somebody with an independent view, somebody who's got experience in a broad spectrum of this kind of situation to say, hey, let's look at that. Hey, let's look at that.
Yeah, and sometimes the answer is, well, you're now working from home. You don't really need the car. Maybe you can sell it, turn it back in and free up some cash that way.
Yep.
Maybe you don't need the premises you're living in and you can downside. Maybe your rents have gone down. You can move to a cheaper place. Maybe you can sell your house, cash in. Maybe you've got some investments that can be liquidated. I mean, there's always a bunch of different options to consider.
I mean, it's worth mentioning that half the people that call us, we actually recommend a solution that doesn't involve us because they've called early enough that we could diagnose the problem and they have options. To get back to my daughter's example, so let's say we hadn't taken her in to have her finger x-rayed. And so wasn't treated properly. Probably she'd injure it again because it wasn't immobilized. And instead of having a splint on for a couple of weeks, we end up with some sort of surgery or much more invasive procedure on her hand.
Yep.
So it's,
because those kind of problems don't get better if you wait.
Right. And financial problems don't go away by themselves either. I mean, it's something that you've got to first identify that there is an issue and then talk to somebody.
Yeah, and that's kind of how compound interest works. It gets bigger and bigger and worse and worse. So,
Right.
Okay, well, I think that's an excellent summary and a good way to finish it. So the point is, bankruptcy is not caused by people just spending too much. It's a lot more nuanced than that. There are a lot of things that get people into trouble, and in a lot of cases through no fault of their own. So the solution is to understand, number one, that, okay, there were a bunch of external factors. And let's face it, living through the pandemic, we all understand the word external factors now.
You got that right.
This is not a shock anymore. So take a step back. Whatever the issue is, whether it's a medical issue, financial issue, whatever, talk to a professional, let them give you the big picture. And then from there, you can start working out solutions.
Right. Develop a plan that'll get you out of debt.
Simple as that. Easy to say, but it takes some work. So again, that's where you got to put the effort into it,
Right.
tracking down the professionals. Ted, thanks very much for being here. That is our show for today. Thanks for listening. Until next week, I'm Doug Hoyes. That was Debt Free in 30.